The gospel says, listen now, the work of God is enough. You have nothing to prove. Notice the first verse there. It says, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle and set apart for the gospel. Now, what is common about this greeting is that Paul wrote a lot of his letters like this. He began with this kind of initial greeting to the church. He would say, hey, I'm Paul. You know who I am. I planted you, right? Because that's generally what had happened. As Paul traveled the world after he became a Christian, he planted churches wherever he went. And oftentimes he would teach to them and explain to them who God was and what he had done for them in Jesus and how their lives were now to look different than before. But not so with the book of Romans. Paul actually never planted this church. He had never been to Rome either. Someone else did. It's amazing to think about that. Romans, man, the people of Rome lived in an empire that is much like ours, and yet churches were planted. Even in a culture that seemed like, man, everyone was so lost, and there's so many different religions, and man, there's so much going on, and yet churches were planted there. And not even by Paul. We don't even know the names of the individuals who planted these churches, which should tell all of us right off the bat that you can do amazing things for God, and no one needs to know your name. You have nothing to prove. And Paul writes this letter. He begins this letter by greeting them in this way. Notice, though, that he doesn't call on any of his own credentials. He calls himself a servant of Christ. In the Greek, it means a bondservant, a slave. He's a slave of Christ Jesus, called an apostle. Now, he's writing to both Jews and Gentiles. So to the Jews, he could have said, man, listen, I'm the Hebrew of Hebrews. Born from the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day. He is a Jewish scholar, a rabbi in and of himself. To the Gentiles, to the Romans, he could have said, listen, I'm a Roman citizen just like you. You should listen to me. Because again, he's wanting them to listen to him, to consider him to be an authority in their life. Yet he doesn't take that route. He is willing to say, I'm a servant of Christ. In other words, what God has done in his life is doing something inside of him that is freeing him up from the need to prove himself to people. So much so that he's willing to say his whole life is set apart for the gospel. In other words, he's separated from every other kind of identity, and he is defined solely by this. He is defined by the good news of Jesus. The most distinguishable quality about his life is the gospel. Can we say that about ourselves? In 2021, what will you be set apart for? You see, we have so much division, even in the church, that I think a lot of us feel like as we enter into this new year, the same old problems are going to be around. And so many of us operate and walk up to each other and operate in our relationships as if we have something to prove to each other, when really we don't. If the work of God is enough, which it is, you have nothing to prove to anybody. Now, for some of you listening, I know that's kind of hard to consider, but I want you to imagine that this is a better gospel than the gospel that you are hearing today. Because there are other forms of the good news. There is the good news, there is the gospel according to self-discovery, which is so popular today, which essentially says, man, create within yourself your own identity. Dig deep within who you are, pull out what you most want to be, and create for yourself an identity. And be that. Validate yourself. So there is this kind of popular notion today that, man, I don't care what people think, this is who I'm going to be. Unfortunately, though, we go about telling people that we don't care what they think. But at the same time, we want them to validate us. That gospel in the end doesn't work. It doesn't help. It doesn't actually satisfy us. We need an identity. We need an identity that's been given to us where we are freed from the need to prove ourselves constantly to other people. And man, Paul, he has this view. I mean, his own name, Paul, means little. Every time he writes these massive letters, he remembers for his own good that he himself is little, a servant of Christ. I want you guys to consider that, man, maybe the mighty work of God, maybe the miracle of God in your life this new year is only blocked by one thing. That's your ego. Your ego. Maybe the one thing that's holding you back from experiencing an incredible work of God in your life is yourself. You don't have a right view of yourself. But there is something about the gospel, about what Jesus has done for us, that it's enough. We have nothing to prove to anybody because you are already fully accepted by God because of Jesus. It's like having a resume that gets you your best job, your dream job, and gets you all the connections you ever wanted. That's what it means to have the work of Jesus placed on you. You already got the best resume. Every door is open for you. You are already fully accepted by the only one who ultimately matters. You have nothing to prove to anybody else.